Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. We've received apologies from Bob Doris, who will be attending another committee to move amendments this morning. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. This is taking items 5 and 6. Item 5 is consideration of today's evidence from the Climate Change Committee. Item 6 is consideration of our work programme. Are we agreed to take these items in private? We are agreed. Thank you. Our second item of business is an evidence session with the Climate Change Committee. Today's session will focus on the adaptation to climate change and the CCC's view on progress on adaptation. And I'd welcome Richard Miller, the head of adaptation for the Climate Change Committee. Thank you for attending this morning. And I'm going to offer you the chance to make some brief introductory remarks, and I'll just say that no politician we've ever asked has been able to keep them brief, but let's see how you get on. Richard.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and give evidence to yourself this morning. I'm Richard Miller. I'm the head of adaptation at the Climate Change Committee, which is the public body set up to provide advice to governments around the UK on both reducing emissions and adapting to the effects of climate change. So my opening remarks are going to focus on what we know about the effects of climate change we're seeing and how we should be thinking about planning for that in the future. So the first starting point is that we're increasingly clear on the evidence here and now that climate change is bringing impacts and affecting our societies both globally but also here within Scotland and the wider UK. The world is around 1.3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial now, and warming at about 0.25 degrees per decade. And all of that is associated with the effects of human influence on increasing the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we know that means that we'll be reaching globally the level of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial in the early 2030s. So within the next decade, we will see that happening, and the impacts we're seeing to date are indicative of what we might expect to see in terms of weather extremes. And it's these plans that we have in place in terms of the current Scottish National Adaptation Plan and other plans around the country that will either prepare or not prepare us for that climate change at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial and keeping to rise. What does that mean in terms of impacts that brings here in Scotland? So we know that flood risk is going to continue to grow. Maybe about another 100,000 or so properties might be at risk beyond those that are at risk already today by the middle of the century. There'll be increasing drought risk, particularly in the eastern part of the country, as we have those hotter and drier summers matching the wetter and warmer winters that we're seeing in the other parts of the year. So too much water in some times of the year, too little in others. Sea level rise will keep rising around the coasts of the country for decades, if not centuries to come under all futures. We might expect about 15 centimetres or so here in Edinburgh by the middle of the century. And increasing wildfire risk. We're obviously seeing that already today. The first mega wildfire that was recorded in the entire UK in Scotland earlier this year is a good example. So what's needed is both reducing emissions, which will help reduce the levels of climate change if the world reduces emissions in the second half of the century. But we know that there's this inevitable period of climate change through to around the middle of the century that will happen almost irrespective of how fast the world reduces emissions. And it's that we need to be planning for and preparing for today with proactive and prudent adaptation planning. Our role really is to sort of set out what we think good can look like and to provide an independent scrutiny on different adaptation plans from governments around the country. And really what we think is needed to move us beyond where we are now on adaptation is a clearer sense of what we are seeking to achieve. What does good look like with adaptation? That's an area where all governments, both here in the UK but also around the world, are struggling. But we are increasingly needing to set out a more clear, specific and measurable ambition of what we're seeking to achieve so that governments can hold itself to account, but also the public can have that accountability of what they're expecting from government and wider society. What does climate resilience mean? Does that mean, for instance, that we're going to have accept rising flood risk, or are we saying actually we think that we need to at least hold the line that we should be not letting flood risk escalate beyond what it is today? What is our role as the Climate Change Committee? So our role is to provide evidence on this. We provide that scrutiny role, but we also provide evidence around what are the risks and opportunities of climate change to the country, but also increasingly what can be done. And the package of work we're focusing on the moment is a package we'll publish in May next year, which will set out an updated view of what the risks and opportunities are to Scotland from climate change, but also, crucially for the first time, an evidence base on what we think can be done about it, what effective adaptation looks like in some of the key areas where adaptation is needed, and what might be some of the objectives and targets that could turn those evidence on adaptation into quantified ambition at the national level and move us forward from where we are now to a more comprehensive and a more strategic approach to adaptation, which can make a difference to people on the ground.
Thanks for that. I get the starter question, which is the easy one, I guess, is that you've suggested to the UK government that by the end of the century, climate change will outstrip what was agreed or the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that 4-degree rise was probably more likely. What's made you make that assessment? What is it that's driving that?
Yes, so you're right. So we provided advice in October to Minister Hardy, the Minister in DEFRA in the UK government responsible for adaptation, on what we think an effective planning assumption for adaptation would be. And for that, we really looked at what do we think is the likely futures for what's going to happen for global emissions and the climate change that we expect, because I think our committee's assumption is that we should be planning for what we actually expect as our most likely outcome, but also considering the sort of plausible worst cases. And if you look at where the world is going right now, we're obviously in COP30, the Conference of the Parties that happens annually on climate change in Brazil right now. But the pledges from countries around the world show global emissions about holding roughly constant at where they are now. And if you were to say, well, what's the climate consequence of that? That means continued warming, and warming approaching 1.5 degrees in the 2030s, and then continuing on to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2050. The further you take this out, the harder it gets to project with certainty. But if you're continuing to the end of the century without significant increases in ambition, you might be looking at around 2 to 3 degrees of warming realised globally by the end of the century. So we think that is a trajectory that right now is our credible best estimate of where the world might be going, and therefore what prudent planning here in Scotland or in the UK more broadly on preparing for climate risk should look at. But we do know it's possible to warm faster than that if you had a regression in the ambition globally to reduce emissions, or if the climate response turned out to be a bit more severe and more rapidly warming than we might expect in our central case, then it's certainly possible still that you might see global temperatures reaching about 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial by the middle of the century, and in the region of 4 degrees by the end of the century. So considering that central case and planning against it now as terms of prudent planning, but also being mindful of those longer-term investments that might need to consider what happens if climate change is more severe or if continues significantly in the second half of the century, if you're making towns, investment decisions around physical assets that are not going to move. Those are the kinds of things that we think you should be thinking about now, both nationally for setting national adaptation plans, but also at the level of individual sectors or organisations making their own adaptation planning.
So, Richard, just so I can understand that, it appears to me you're saying that 4 degrees by the end of the century is possible, but 3 degrees is more likely. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yes. So okay. Our central expectation would be if the world doesn't increase its ambition beyond what it's doing now, reaching 2 degrees in the middle of the century and something in the region of 2 to 3 degrees by the end of the century. But it's possible that it's at higher levels. And it's also possible that we do increase ambition globally and keep to the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. That is holding well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It is still possible to do that, and we think it's right that governments in Scotland and in the UK do their bit to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to help the world reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to pursue that. But prudent planning on the resilience side means thinking about what we might actually expect based on where we're going right now, as well as pursuing that higher ambition to keep to lower levels.
Okay, so there's much bigger players in the world than the United Kingdom as far as reducing global emissions. And I guess we've seen a bit of a step change in China on what they're trying to achieve. So do you want to just give us an opinion on what we've seen in the last year as far as things that have changed, China being, I guess, one of them, Richard?
Yes, I think in terms of what's happening globally, I think, well, really the story of the last decade is the changes in the technologies, the changes in the costs of the technologies that have made a real difference to that curve on where the world is going. If we were having this conversation a decade or so ago, we could very credibly be talking around that 4 degrees by the end of the century being our best estimate, our sort of most likely outcome. The changes that we've seen in the technologies, particularly on renewable energy and the costs of that coming down, have bent the curve away from that. They've obviously not bent it away enough yet to get to the goals that governments have set themselves in the Paris Agreement of holding well below 2 degrees Celsius, but they've made a real difference to shift that central expectation down towards the 2 to 3 degrees range by the end of the century. And we know that governments have ambitious commitments in aggregate. So if the current targets for 2030 for all the different governments that have pledged them under the Paris Agreement were met, and then the subsequent net zero targets that lots of different countries, including, say, China for 2060, have made, then delivering that ambition is credibly consistent with keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So the ambition is increasingly in the right place in the aggregate. The challenge is delivery on the emissions reduction side. And then pivoting, I think, to the climate resilience side, there I think the challenge is both being able to articulate what is our ambition and then what are we doing to actually deliver that. And that is a challenge at the global level as well as domestically. The Paris Agreement has been a lot fuzzier, really, in terms of what it's meant in terms of the climate resilience and adaptation bits. But right now in this meeting in Brazil, they are trying to discuss how do you measure the global goal on adaptation to actually improve resilience so that we're in a better framework internationally to be able to say what climate resilience means and how fast the world and the UK and Scotland as part of that is moving towards it.
So you've said that ambition is one thing, and what's helping ambition seem more likely is the reducing costs of some of the technology. But the cost for some of the technology actually at the ground level in people's houses still remains stubbornly high, and it's difficult for people to meet those costs. Do you think that's going to be a challenge? Because at the latest COP, there was talk, if you don't take everyone with you, you're never going to succeed. Do you want to just elaborate on that?
So I think our advice would, certainly come behind that last sentiment that, people need to come with this transition. It's going to be one that extends over multi-decades. It's about having credible targets that we know how they can be delivered and working out how that can be done in a way that's equitable across the different parts of society that need to contribute to that. We know there are some bits that are harder than others in this transition, and we've made a lot of good progress in Scotland and in the UK on some of the easier bits, for want of a better word. Not that they were easy at the time, but making some of the big changes we've made in our electricity system, finding ways to roll out that continued decarbonisation into people's homes, into agriculture, into how we use our land, and doing those things in a way that's consistent with trying to build climate resilience, I think is a key next step for all of this, particularly in, say, the land sector, where we know that while we're trying to increase the amount of carbon stored in the landscapes, that's only going to deliver on the decarbonisation that it's seeking to do if it's the right tree in the right place, for example. That's going to be trees that are consistent with the climate we're expecting in decades to come, that are not going to be exposed to the risks of pests and diseases that we might see. Because if those things happen, we lose the benefits of those trees, both for nature, both for people, but also for the carbon.
Okay, so just before we leave this, I mean, I think my fear is that a lot of the heat pumps and the air source pumps that you need are driven as you know, by electricity, and the price for electricity remains stubbornly high. So, you know, if you're going to install a heat pump in a house, you might be looking at 17,000 and then still massive electricity bills. How are you going to, you know, is that a stumbling block?
I think electricity prices is really key to the transition, and in our last package of advice that sort of set out the pathways for our advice on the UK's 7th carbon budget and the carbon budgets in Scotland, our main recommendation in that was making electricity cheaper for this reason, really. So looking at the challenges of the legacy costs on electricity and potentially how you can rebalance some of those costs across gas and electricity that can deal with that exact thing, because we know that the efficient thing to do in most of these systems is increasingly to electrify stuff, electrify heat, electrify transport, but that needs to be done in parallel with making sure that electricity costs are cheap for people.
Everyone's aim, but stubbornly remaining high, I would say to most people. Mark, the next question is from you.
I mean, the goal of the Paris Agreement was to keep well below 2 degrees, and even then, there was going to be significant impact globally. Quite frankly, I'm horrified at what you're saying about 3 degrees, and even the prospect of 4 degrees. I mean, it's easy just for these numbers to kind of slip off the tongue, but can you just say in a nutshell what 4 degrees would mean globally?
Yes, so 4 degrees globally is a big change. It sounds small, all of these numbers, as you said. It's a big change. It's a big change. Yeah. It's, when we're talking about changes that big, we are talking about a change globally that is on the same scale as the changes between the current climate we've seen and, say, the last ice age, obviously in the other direction. But I think that's just indicative of how big a change to the global climate system something like 4 degrees really would be. When we're in the last ice age, obviously, a lot of where we are now was covered in ice sheets, etc. So we're talking about a change that's similar to that magnitude, but in the more warmer direction. So I think really our levels of precision in what we could say really about what would happen are challenging. But we also know that that many of the things that we are seeing today already will continue to change and get more extreme as we go towards ever higher levels of warming. So things like the intensity of the heat waves, the frequency of the heat waves, the risk, the wetter winters that we see already in Scotland, the sea level rise will ultimately be coloured a lot by what level of warming we reach in terms of how much of the ice caps and stuff ultimately do melt, and how much of that really long-term sea level rise, which could be multiple metres, gets actually realised. So at 4 degrees, that's where I think we would see some of those really big changes, and obviously it sets the risk of quite fundamental tipping points occurring in the global climate system to quite high levels. So things like the total collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is part of the system that brings us the Gulf Stream, and the heat in the Gulf Stream that keeps...
What would that mean for the UK?
If that happens, that would potentially actually mean a lot colder temperatures than we're ever used to. So really quite sort of fundamental changes in even the sign of climate change that might happen if that occurs. That is something that increases as we go to those higher levels of warming, but it's also risks that can happen at lower levels. And part of, I think, prudent adaptation planning is trying to get a much better understanding of how you monitor some of those changes in the global climate system. And we can have a better preparedness for those more sort of discontinuous changes that we might see.
Okay. I mean, you're using quite unemotional language there, but I think if anybody sits back and actually thinks about what that would actually mean for people, for nature, for the entire global community, it's a vast impact. I mean, it's interesting that as CCC, you've moved away from, a very, very tightly constrained discussion around 2 degrees and 1.5 to now starting to think about tipping points. And I guess your advice is that policymakers should start thinking about the world that we'd live in post the tipping point. such as the collapse of that North Atlantic conveyor, and a completely fundamental shift in our climate, like, unprecedented in human history.
I think we need to consider those as planning, but actually think, I think the things that are actually the most motivating are the stuff that's in the sort of centre of the distribution, for want of a better word, the stuff that's increasingly we're already seeing and we just know is going to happen. So, we've seen the warmest years on record in 2022 in Scotland, temperatures, reaching nearly 35 degrees C, and that previous record being broken by about 2 degrees Celsius. We know that even over the next decade or so, the chances of seeing temperatures as high as that and higher, is significant. Like, if we look across the whole of the UK, we obviously saw 40 degrees reached for the first time in 2022, and the next decade, there's about a 50-50 chance, according to the latest science, that we'd see that again. And it's those kinds of impacts that we're just not even prepared for now. Yeah. The increasingly hot summers, the drought risk it brings in summers, and the wetter winters with that increasing rainfall. Other things that I think actually we need to start with and get on with first in preparing and actually reducing the impacts we're seeing on people and ecosystems today. And that will be the thing that will make the most difference to people here and now.
I can see you're trying to continue to keep us motivated so we don't catastrophize and then say, oh, well, what's the point, because we can't make any progress. So there's obviously the change that is coming anyway as we edge towards 1.5 and over that. As policymakers, how should we then be looking at, for example, flood defences, investment in Scottish Water, for example, over the next 10, 20, 30 years? What scenarios should we be preparing for at this point? Is it about saying, okay, we think it's going to be about 1.6, 1.7, therefore we should be upgrading our flood mitigation measures along that lines, or should we be looking at potentially far greater increases? Yeah. And how do you pitch that? There's an immediate investment programme. Scottish Water will be the next 5 years, I think. But how do policymakers, investors look at that longer-term investment in infrastructure, bearing in mind what may come? Because it would be irresponsible not to consider that outcome.
No, indeed, and I think that's right. Investing in adaptation has to grapple with this uncertainty about exactly what level of warming will happen, but it can't be defeated by it. So I think there's actually a lot we can learn from different examples of where investment has been made to deal with these uncertainties. You can do that in two different ways, really, ultimately. At the sort of edges of the spectrum, you can do that in terms of very precautionary investment, so looking at some of the highest change scenarios and almost baking in a level of anticipation of much higher impacts in the future. Like, historically, if you look for things like how we built our sewers in the Victorian era, for instance, you can see a lot of that there, this sort of precautionary approach of planning for, okay, we're going to need a much bigger system in the future. We don't need it now, but we're going to build that in at the start and take that sort of upfront investment that's needed to do that. That is one way. Obviously, it requires mobilising more resources in the immediate term to pay off down the line. The other way that we're also can deal with this is in a sort of more of a sort of pragmatic, flexible planning approach. So sort of thinking about how you can make investments that will make a real difference now in terms of building out that flood defence, but also building it in a way that would allow you to extend it, to improve it, to make it more effective as and when the time comes, if the time comes to do that. And again, we see examples around the UK of how you can increasingly do that. Something like, say, the Thames Estuary, the Thames Barrier plan is a plan that has that baked in to some extent around we have a barrier now. There is a process, at least, to try and work out when you will make that decision on what else you need to do. If you need a new barrier, at what time is it a sensible time to invest in that? So approaching adaptation pragmatically in a sort of flexible way like that is the other way to grapple with this.
Are some of these infrastructure solutions scalable? So the next phase, you mentioned Thames Barrier. Would that have a 3 or 4 degree world in mind when looking at options? So a future investment in the next 5 to 10 years could then be scaled up in the decades ahead to then meet the needs of a 3 or 4 degree warming world, or do you just reach a point where you go, okay, we're just going to have to just think again?
Yeah, and I think that is, so that is certainly the philosophy of how those approaches try and do it. And it's exactly that of anticipating, well, what would happen if we reach this level of change? Would we be able to just adapt the asset, adapt your flood defence, adapt what you're doing in terms of urban drainage or whatever in towns to deal with that? Or at some level, do you have to make a fundamentally different decision about how you protect places? Places at the coast are often some of the hardest ones here, where we know that sea level rise will continue for decades, and trying to work through, what are the options? When might you just change your approach? Okay. is part of planning. So I think our real advice is that has to be done on the almost like the asset by asset, the sort of place by place approach. But this principle of considering planning and taking action now for the kinds of climates we'll see at a sort of global level of 2 degrees above pre-industrial by the middle of the century, but considering how you'd respond and change your actions in that sort of higher warming world towards the 4 degrees.
Do you think that the Scottish Government's current infrastructure investment plan does recognise that scenario of 3 degrees or 4 degrees? Is that baked into that?
I think a lot of the, I think in Scotland, in the UK, we have a relatively good access to information on climate projections. There are elements that can always be improved, but much of the climate projections we're using in, say, looking at flood risk is roughly consistent with that world of global temperatures reaching about 2 degrees above pre-industrial by the middle of the century. So the sort of additional 100,000 or so homes that we might be expecting to be at risk. Not 3 degrees, but I think increase actually over this period through the next few decades to the middle of the century, actually the difference between 2 and 3 degrees is less pronounced. It's really in that second half of the century that starts to spread out. So if you're focusing on what you can do over the next few decades, there's actually quite consensus among the scenarios of what that means in terms of the hazards we'd expect through to around the middle of the century, which is why I think it's a useful period for thinking about an inevitable period of climate change in all worlds through to around the middle of the century, and having some real certainty about what that might mean, and therefore being able to really bank that relative certainty and take some action based off it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go to Monica next, who's got some questions.
Thank you, convener, and good morning. Just building on from Mark Ruskell's questions and thinking about infrastructure and infrastructure planning, I just wonder, Richard, if you could maybe give a bit more example around what are the most significant impacts of climate change in Scotland over the next 10, 20 and 50 years, particularly in the context of infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So I think really what we expect over the next few decades is a continuation of what we're already starting to see. So, and we can start to really robustly talk about some of the changes that we're seeing in Scotland already. So we've seen the warmest, warmer decades. We've seen the decade of 2010 to 2019 was about 0.7 degrees warmer than the sort of baseline that we used to measure our climate from in Scotland. So we know that change has happened. That's happened in people's lifetimes. And we also know what that's doing in terms of some of the extremes of weather over that period. So we've seen wet has become winter over that period, about 19% increase in the wetness of winters in Scotland over that exact same period of the sort of the average of the 2010 to 2019 decade. And if we were to take that right up to date to the sort of, the decade that ended in 2024, for instance, that'd be about 25% wetter winters. So, quite significant shift in the average wetness of the winters that are seen in Scotland within, a few decades. So really in people's lifetimes. And we're also seeing rainfall be more intense when it falls. And we know that brings infrastructure risks. I guess example we've seen in 2020 was the derailment, and there was a study that came out earlier this year from academics of the university here in Edinburgh looking at the attribution of that rainfall to climate change and finding a robust link between the effects we've had globally on the atmosphere already and the intensity of that rainfall that contributed to the derailment there in Carmont. So some of that is the exact trends that we expect to see continue over the next couple of decades. So continued shift to wetter winters that are warmer, and then a bit of the sort of flip on the water in the summer, that the summers will be drier, particularly raising drought risk in the eastern part of the country. I think where advisory warnings about the persistent lack of rainfall are already in place right now, I think, in some parts of Scotland due to the lack of rainfall since the end of 2024, for instance. And that risk of dry summers and the risk of an occasional dry winter really does raise the risk of drought that we're having to increasingly grapple with. And storms. So the other thing is, obviously, we're sort of seeing the impacts of storms. Those bring some of those intense rainfalls that we were just talking about. And we know the impacts that those bring. Babet in 2023, 30,000 homes there left without power for a while, significant infrastructure disruption on trunk roads and school closures. So I think actually just looking at what we've seen in the recent past is a pretty good guide for the sense of the direction of the change. And we know that every degree of warming that we see, in addition to the 1.3 degrees the world is at now, will robustly lead to that continued shift in the average climate conditions that we're seeing here in Scotland. So that's the planning we need to be making for now for those changes that we know are pretty inevitable that we will see in coming decades.
Thank you, Richard. That was comprehensive. So we know there's a risk of increased flooding, wildfires and droughts across Scotland because of climate change, and you've described the way that the weather has been changing. Already in Scotland, through the National Planning Framework 4, the current and future impacts of climate change must be taken into account by local development plans. So that's a job for our planning authorities. And in your earlier response to Mark Ruskell, I think you were describing that need for a place-based approach. Just building on your earlier answer then, in which areas in Scotland are we least prepared, whether that's in terms of sectors or geographical parts of Scotland? And we also know that we do need to review agricultural practices and infrastructure planning. Are there any particular comments you would want to make on that?
Yep. So I think what we've seen in Scotland adaptation planning is similar in the broad picture to what we see in the other parts of the UK, in that progress is being made in planning particularly. We are getting better across the board. There's obviously variation in different areas, but across the board in general, we are getting a lot better at being able to consider climate change in making plans in key sectors. What is the big challenge that persists and is a common challenge in I think globally, as well as all the other parts of the UK, is seeing the plans that we're making lead to evidence of delivery on the ground that is going to make a difference to the risks we're facing. And that's, I think, the areas where, both in our most recent assessment of progress in Scotland, but also in all the other progress reports we made across the other parts of the UK, that we see the real gap, this implementation gap between doing best practice on considering these climate changes and understanding what they mean, but then actually driving action on the ground. So I think it was just one of the outcomes that we looked at in our last progress report out of about 33, looking at climate change and what we think is needed to move towards more resilience in Scotland, that we saw unambiguous evidence that there was clear indicators that things were moving in the right direction there. So in many areas, the trends are much more mixed, and the challenge is therefore turning planning into delivery on the ground.
Okay. And I wanted to ask some further questions about the different impacts at the different levels of temperature. I think Mark Ruskell's covered that already. So I suppose thinking about modelling and the evidence and the climate science. You know, you've given a fairly favourable answer about some of the work that's happening across the UK, including in Scotland, and that is reassuring on the one hand. But on the other hand, you know, anyone who follows the news sees examples of some local authorities no longer having flood risk committees. There's clearly at a policy level a push for more development to happen, particularly for house building, because we know we need to have enough homes for everyone in the country. How can we continue to ensure that we have robust decisions that follow good evidence, can be taken in a transparent way, that still meet the needs of our communities and have the right development in the right places, but are still rooted in evidence? And if we are to build in an area where there's a higher risk of flooding, for example, that there's proper mitigation built into that. Obviously, I don't want you to get into a particular example or authority, but these are the kind of issues that people do talk about because they worry about how they're going to insure their homes in the future or their business because they see these events happening. So on a very technical level, how can we ensure that frontline decision makers have access to the best possible data when they're making these decisions?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, which gets to the heart of, I think, the challenge on all of this. So our committee's view on this has long been that this needs to start with setting out a much more specific and quantitative framework about what we're seeking to achieve on climate resilience in the round at national levels, that then flows through to those lower levels of delivery with clarity around what the goals are and you know, helps mobilise the right actions and the right resources associated to make them happen. So, you know, in the area of climate change adaptation, we are much less developed than we are on the net zero side in terms of setting out targets for what that means. You know, say that the plan here in Scotland has goal statements, which are, you know, decent statements about what we're trying to achieve, but the challenge is turning those into sort of measurable, specific and operational frame statements that can really therefore drive change. You know, to sort of paraphrase someone who once described it to me as, you know, when we set targets in adaptation, we're doing the equivalent of saying we will reduce some amount of carbon by some date by some measure. You know, we're not very specific, we're not very sort of time-bound and quantitative about what we're seeking to achieve. And our committee believes that taking those steps to actually set some lines in the sand around what we're seeking to achieve and then turning that into a specific goal. And it's always going to be more complicated than in net zero. You know, you can't just use one metric, but trying to identify a few key specific goals, quantitative goals that then can get the whole framework to flow off the back of it, you know, and to sort of work out, well, actually, that is what we're trying to achieve nationally. What would be the most effective way to do that? Where could we spend that resource? What do we need to actually do in terms of putting in place the enabling factors to allow local authorities to do their bit, to allow the public, businesses and households to do their bit? That's what we'd really like to see. And the evidence that we're assessing at the moment and pulling together in our Well-Adapted UK report, which we are going to publish in May next year, will be our contribution to trying to set out what we think some of the evidence on that can be to hopefully enable those next steps to be taken in terms of setting out more specific, more actionable objectives and targets for adaptation around the country to enable that much needed delivery step change to hopefully finally take place.
That's really helpful, Richard, and I'll hand back to convener in just a second, but I suppose in my mind I'm thinking about some of the skills challenges around that, but are there examples internationally of climate adaptation targets that the committee could look at?
There are, yes, and I think it's an area, as I mentioned at the start, that all countries in the world are grappling with this challenge, and I don't think anyone has got it, you know, similar countries to Scotland and to the United Kingdom have got it right yet, but there's a lot we can increasingly learn, I think, from efforts elsewhere. So examples are, you know, that we've looked at recently are the German climate adaptation strategy, which has set out ministry by ministry targets around what it thinks it's seeking to achieve, and and measures toward it. So, in Scotland, we have those statements on what we're trying to achieve. We have some indicators towards that, but what we don't really have is that sort of measure of how much in which indicator is good and what does success look like. In Germany, they're trying to take some more steps toward that. The other place that has done a lot on this recently is Canada, where they have their national adaptation strategy that set out a set of goals and then intermediate steps for, say, what they're trying to achieve by 2050, what does that mean by 2030 in terms of some measurable specific goals. One example from their strategy is avoiding seeking to avoid any heat-related deaths in heat waves by a certain date, for instance. So I think we can learn from some of those examples internationally, but also areas, I think, where resilience has been done for a while and done well, and the classic example a lot of people talk about, which I think is just still a good example, is the Netherlands and the Delta programme they have there at the coast, where they have quite a clear articulation of what is the level of resilience in terms of a 1 in X year flooding event that we will be investing as the public in defences for. So there's a really clear articulation of what that is and an associated fund at a necessary level to actually provide those defences, but also a clear expectation, therefore, if you want more protection, that's where the responsibility then transfers to you as a homeowner, as a business, etc., to provide the additional protections you might seek to have beyond that.
Okay.
Thank you. Of course, funding is key. I'll hand back to the convener. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. There's a few supplementaries on this subject, so I'm going to go to the Deputy Convener first, followed by Kevin, followed by me. So, Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Just sticking with the theme around, obviously, infrastructure investment, there obviously is anxiety around the cost of investment that's needed in order to meet our climate change targets. You heard earlier about the cost of things like heat pumps, etc. And there is a bit of a narrative that would suggest that actually we should just ditch the net zero targets and get rid of the 2045 or 2050 target, but just still try to make some progress in tackling climate change. Is it fair to say that there's a direct correlation between global warming or climate changing and the amount of investment we then have to make into adaptation as a result? And if so, to what extent do you think there is the risk that if we ditch our national targets for tackling climate change, we simply push the costs into having to do more investment in climate adaptation?
Yes, I think there is definitely a relation between the two things. So ultimately, getting to near net zero globally is what we just know from the science is needed to stop the planet warming. So unless the world gets very close to net zero, we will just see global temperatures keeping rising. And as we've just discussing, every additional 0.1 degree increase in global warming, we can robustly link that to changes in the hazards that we see here at home in terms of those increasingly wet winters, those rising seas, and those changing drought and heat risks. So unless the world gets to net zero, we will be sort of keep chasing an ever-moving target, really, in terms of what the climate actually looks like. And that's just going to require more and more investment on the resilience side if we were going to deal with that. So I think they are both two sides of the same coin. I think reducing emissions and adapting to climate change, in that they are both necessary and complementary in having a rounded response to climate change. So both trying to get emissions towards net zero and help the world do that to ultimately stop the climate here at home changing is one part of the contribution we think we need to be making. But the other side is also recognising that it's going to take several decades at the very least for the world, even in the most optimistic scenarios, to get to net zero, and the planet will keep warming, the climate will keep changing until that time at the very least. So we also just know that inevitable period of warming is something we're going to have to grapple with in all worlds, and we're needing to be planning for that now. And yes, investing in adaptation does require some upfront resources to build the flood defences, to build infrastructure in a way that is consistent with the future climate. But those investments, if done right, are ultimately cost-saving because we are reducing the costs of the impacts to society, to businesses, to homeowners, but also to the public purse down the line if we make those wise investments on the resilience side and do them in an effective way today. Okay.
So delaying achieving net zero brings a cost to it from an adaptation perspective. For the investment would have to go into infrastructure then?
So achieving net zero will help reduce the ultimate need that we have to spend on adaptation investment, but we know that it won't reduce it to nothing even if we achieve net zero tomorrow, that we would still be needing to invest in our resilience to the weather extremes we've already seen change today and the changes that we just know are going to happen over the decades to at least the middle of the century.
Okay. Given the need to invest in infrastructure to meet the existing changes in our climate we're experiencing that you mentioned earlier on, given the capital investment profile of the Scottish UK government and their infrastructure investment planning going forward, do you see the level and scale of investment which is necessary to ensure that we've got the right infrastructure in place to deal with the challenges that we face with climate change?
Yeah, so I think there's two bits to that. So I'd say one is our starting point on what we're actually spending on climate resilience. Our understanding of that is quite low. We don't really track that as a sort of standard thing very well across either public spend but also the spend in the wider economy. So that even understanding what we are spending today would help us, be able to say much more robustly about exactly what needs to happen to that going forward to meet it. I think the other side of it is that actually the evidence on how you can take adaptation action suggests that if, particularly for big infrastructure investment programs, if you are thinking about climate change when you're designing that infrastructure, when you're putting it in the ground at the outset, that the costs of dealing with that are just much, much cheaper than dealing with it later down the line. So if we can incorporate climate resilience into some of those investment decisions in an effective way, so building homes that, if we know we're in an area of flood risk, they come with the protections that are needed to mean that you're not just locking in new homes that are going to get flooded and have costs to those homeowners down the line. That is just a lot cheaper to do that up front than trying to retrofit it later on. And that's a pretty sort of common message across these sort of areas of infrastructure investment. So thinking about ways to actually just keep the investment costs as low and focused as we can means thinking about this at the upfront instead of waiting down the line and trying to fix the holes when they appear.
So it feels to me that a lot of infrastructure investment that takes place to deal with some of these challenges by and large happens as a result of incidents occurring. Serious floods, etc. So we have to put in flood mitigation measures in order to deal with that. You mentioned that we don't really track this type of investment. So at the CCC, given the independent advice that you provide to both the Scottish and UK government, are you able to quantify exactly how much either of these governments are spending on climate adaptation specifically at this present time?
So there are bits we know much better. So some of the spending on flood defences is a good example of an area we know that is really strongly connected to adaptation. We can there's very high transparency around what those budgets are around the country. It's some of the other bits where it's a lot more harder, and a good example is some of the stuff in the land sector where you might be doing something on farmed land or restoring peatland, say, in some way, and that has multiple benefits. Some of those will be for the resilience of that, the farming, for the ecosystem, but also for nature. So how you actually there's some accounting challenge, quite sort of boring, processy one, at the heart of this that actually we do need to probably make some more progress on to be able to sort of say exactly what the spend is in total across the pieces. But we know, you know, when we did a report on investment in the UK needed for climate resilience, based on all the evidence we could pull together, we estimated that to deal with the climate risks that were summarised in the most recent climate change risk assessment from 2021, that would be the order of 5 to 10 billion of investment across the UK to deal with some of those risks. But the final point I'd say is I think this fundamentally comes back to that same point on what is our ambition here, you know, because I think without a clear articulated ambition on what we're trying to achieve on resilience, it's really difficult to say exactly what's the right level of investment that's needed to meet it. And so to sort of take an example on the floods, for instance, is our ambition to, you know, we have, you know, 300,000 homes at risk of flood in Scotland today. That might rise by another 100,000 by 2050. What is our ambition? Is it to just kind of hold the line? Would good look like keeping the flood risk in 2050 at about today's levels? That could be the answer. Or is it, or actually what are we saying to the 300,000 that are already at risk today? You know, is it good adaptation actually dealing with some of that and actually pushing that number down to a much lower level? And I think that's ultimately a question for governments on the different costs and benefits of doing that, but also the values of, you know, what do people expect from things like flood protection? Is it just holding the line, or is it actually just an improved state of resilience that we'd like to achieve? And only really by answering that question can we really take, you know, the next steps in refining, well, that's the goal, and therefore we can really tell you much more clearly about what's the amount of investment that's needed to mobilise to meet it.
Okay, and just my final question. You mentioned there the 2021 Climate Adaptation Risk Report and the figure of 5 to 10 billion pounds. Is that an annual figure, or is that a figure over a 5-year period, which a lot of capital investment programmes are designed over?
So that would be that's an estimate of the annual figure that would be needed for across the entire UK for investment into climate resilience to achieve that. But that would be a full society figure. So, you know, we know increasingly that, yeah, some of these challenges will be directly dealt with by governments and by public funding, flood defences being one example of that. But there are also large bits that are going to be for businesses, for homeowners to invest in themselves. And that number would incorporate all of that into that figure.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Kevin, I think you've got some questions.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. A lot of the issues we've been discussing today are pretty high level. One of the things which I don't think we do enough of is look at or try to portray to folk their day-to-day lives. So if you live next to the River Dee in Aberdeen, you can see quite clearly this year a level of water scarcity that there hasn't been for some time. But equally, you may be a person who lives quite near the Dee that's been affected by flooding in recent times. So I'd be keen to know how you feel, the Climate Change Committee feels, around about actually getting messaging to a local level, which persuades folk that the net zero targets are the right ones, and also gives the recognition that's required that resilience planning and investment in infrastructure is required. Would you like to comment on that, please, Mr. Miller?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, as you said, like, these things are just so much more resonant when people can relate to them, an example that they've experienced or they know people that have experienced. And I think everyone can do that. And I think actually the advantage of the climate resilience bit is that we don't need to tell people why to care about these things. People already care about not having their homes flooded, about, you know, their health system working and being able to access it, and not, you know, hospitals being flooded or overheating in other parts of the country. And those lived experiences, I think, really tell through on that. One of the pieces of work we've been doing to feed into our next set of advice in May is actually convening a sort of citizens panel to get people to really consider this question, to talk about their views and experiences and therefore their perspectives on what might be done. And one of the things that really comes through from that is people know about this, but they're really surprised when they actually get into some of the details on what some of the impacts are. They find it, quite full on around what the level of impacts are, and the idea that even when we get to net zero will stop the problem getting worse ultimately, the global net zero, but that won't mean our climate will go back to what it was 20, 30 years ago, that these conditions we have today are the ones that we'll have forever, even if we sort of stopped emitting tomorrow. And I think people find that quite powerful, and a strong sense that people want something to be done, but they also want it to be done well. I think those are some of the key messages we're taking out from this. And coupled with that, a sense of people who are vulnerable being a priority for people. So people who are particularly, exposed to the climate impacts of flooding or of heat or of drought being priorities for what adaptation should be seeking to do to make action as effective as possible in reducing risk.
You've talked about houses at risk of flooding, and I have to say that over the years it has frustrated me greatly to see developments called, for example, the Meadows, and then this surprise that this area is suddenly prone to flooding because its historical name has basically told us something. Ms Lennon picked up on this in earlier questioning, but in terms of as we move forward in decision making, do you think that decision makers need to take cognizance of insurance companies and what they are saying about possible premiums or not even insuring in some of these areas as we move forward?
Yeah, I think insurance is an area that shows the challenge in this space. We have taken the decision to have a flood reinsurance scheme, a flood re that socialises some of those costs. But I think all of my answers tie back to what we're seeking to do, because we took that decision to say to put in place flood re in parts of the country that would basically allow homes in flood risk areas to continue to be insurable. But that was basically on the premise of maintaining. That was on the premise of we're already grappling with that challenge when we have this current level of flood risk that with these number of properties at risk, and we're now dealing with the climate challenge, which is going to increase the number of homes that are at risk. And if good looks like getting to just holding the line that we are today, then how are we going to deal with those properties, and are we going to keep running a sort of flood reinsurance scheme into the future or not? So I think it's one where it really crystallises some of those challenges. If you're buying or selling a home now in some of these areas, you might rightly be thinking around, would the person buying it from me, whenever I might choose to sell it, be able to get flood insurance, and therefore what does that mean for my prospects of selling it? So I think it's a good example of how it kind of, that forward thinking on this can actually map back to what it means for people and the value of their homes today, really.
Thank you. Final question, and very brief, convener. In terms of the resources for infrastructure, do you think that there needs to be holistic resilience investment, so that we're not doing one thing in one area which might have a major impact on areas downstream, for example, in terms of flood prevention measures?
Yeah, I think flooding is an area where it's just fundamentally catchment based, isn't it? So what happens in the upper part of the catchment affects what happens in terms of the flood risk downstream, often in some of the towns and cities that we have. So it's an example where that's just how it works. That's the scale of the system, and therefore we need to be planning and dealing with that in how we respond to it. So working in a, as you say, holistic way across those catchments to find what's the most effective way to reduce that risk, to do the interventions where where it's going to be most effective to do so, which might not always be at the site where the impact might be felt. So join up is key, I think, to make that work really, and to properly prepare, particularly for flood risk.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I ask my question, I'm just going to remind members that I am a farmer, or I have a farming business in Speyside and an interest in the River Spey. But you're talking about new infrastructure and what we need to do in the future to plan against it. Surely we need to look back at the old infrastructure as well. And Kevin has just mentioned about water shortages on the Dee, which I think is interesting. But in the Spey this year, we were at the level where no distillery below Carron Bridge could abstract any water. So all the distilleries shut down, which is a major economic impact to the community. And at the same time, water was being abstracted from the headwaters of the Spey to go down to the Lochie to turn electricity generators, and down the Tay to help them with their water shortage while we were suffering in Speyside. Do you think, looking back at some of the old projects that were set up in the 1950s, which might have seemed right at the time because there was a more sustainable harvest, when there isn't a sustainable harvest, are actually as important looking at shiny new infrastructure projects to make sure that everyone has something of what they need?
Yeah, I think existing infrastructure, yeah, as you said, we've talked a decent bit about new infrastructure, but existing infrastructure is the next level of challenge up, I think, because we know that stuff exists, it's on the ground, there are people who use it and stakeholders of it, and trying to deal with that stuff is harder, but needs to be done. You know, things like, say, our transport network, that exists where it exists, you know, and most of that is going to stay there and going to be in the places where we are. So actually figuring out how we like retrofit those assets to improve resilience is a key bit of the challenge. For the example you're talking about there, I think it's another one where it sort of shows about the sort of need for the join up across the different areas to really figure out what are the people's priorities through governments and through the structures that exist there. You know, again, looking internationally, I think there are regions of the Algarve in Portugal, for instance, where they say, okay, we experience droughts, but our economic value is in our golf courses. So that's actually in a sector that's prioritised for access to abstraction to water, even at times of drought. But they've had those some of those discussions around what are the things we value and what are our priorities to be able to sort of come to that perspective. And I think that's stuff we'll have to increasingly tackle on particularly on the water issue around, what is the priority ranking of different water uses, as well as keeping water in the environment for nature in times of drought.
I think water being so fundamental to everything we do, putting a value on it is difficult. But I do remember back even in the 80s being told when I was a young soldier that most future wars would be fought over water, that actually if we don't get water right, it's going to be a serious problem, especially when we have such high levels and such low levels in the same year. Okay, Mark, over to you. Sorry. I think you've got some questions now.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted just to stay on the flooding and the investment issue, because you have had evidence from Audit Scotland that the costs of the major flood management schemes, the concrete schemes, I guess you could call them, you know, have trebled over the last decade. So, you know, bearing in mind what you said earlier around, you know, the potential impacts, particularly if we start looking at, you know, going beyond 2 degrees, is that balance right at the moment? Is there a need to think again about, you know, preventative measures? Is there a need to think about, you know, nature-based solutions, catchment management? It feels at the moment there's a blend of solutions that come forward. You know, we try not to build on the carses in the meadows if we can, although housing developments still happen. You know, there's a nod to nature-based solutions within catchment management, but it never feels like they become a major part of flood mitigation. So given that spiralling cost, what does the future options look like?
Yeah, I think I do think the answer is some form of all of the above for that, and I think the answer varies as well locally. But I think trying to sort of abstract out of what would be the right situation for this catchment or this bit of river even. I think, you know, as I said, when we engage with people on these issues as part of our evidence gathering, I think what they tell us is they want things to be effective. And I think that is the key thing, I think, that really should drive how we choose options. And some of the nature-based options can be very effective, but they also probably suffer in terms of the lack of the quantified evidence base that really, at the moment, can say how effective, what's those sort of the cost-benefit ratios, and how do they stack up against some of the other options. So I think a priority is building out a greater evidence base, and that's starting to occur through some of these projects that are using nature-based solutions, and we'll be able to understand what are the benefits in terms of reduced risk, but also the wider benefits to health or to nature that they can bring. But the more we can basically have a level playing field between the different adaptation options, I think it just creates more power to be able to find the right option in the right place that will be the most effective and will make the biggest difference, and for, you know, and use the money we invest in it most effectively to actually get the outcomes for people, which is the reduced flooding that ultimately people really want to see.
Is it a concern, though, that that baseline keeps shifting? So, you know, thinking about the flood defence scheme that was built in Brechin, I think it was originally designed to deal with a 1 in 20, and now it's 1 in 50. Now I think it's gone down to a 1 in 20 year event. Is there not an issue there with the assessment of risk changing, and actually what we would design for a relatively, you know, commonplace event is now being blown out of the water, quite literally?
Yeah, I think that is one of the challenges of dealing with a changing climate, in that all those statistics change over time, and we have to be not investing for the weather and the climate of the last decade, because we know it's going to be different. So that these have to be forward-looking. So thinking about, you know, the 1 in 20 year event that might be in 2030s or even the 2050s, and what is our credible estimate of that in terms of planning and investing to these levels of resilience, instead of what we've seen in the past. I think one of the simple things that we do know is just very true with climate change is that the past is no longer a good guide to what we expect. We have to look forward, and we have to anticipate. And I think, returning back to some of the points at the start, I think we have to do that increasingly in a flexible way of knowing that we will continue to learn more about how our climate's changing in a particular region, the statistics of rainfall in this part of the country versus that part of the country as we go forward, and the need to therefore design these things in a way that they could be adjusted, scaled as that information emerges. So can you build that flood defence in a way that you could add height to the barriers, you could do other interventions, for instance, that could mitigate the fact that actually what we think the 1 in 20 year event in the next decade actually might be an underestimate of what we might actually see.
Okay. So is the approach then very much about creating the right foundation for adaptation now in the next decade or two, and then being able to kind of build on that rather than say, okay, actually this community is unlivable, you know, we need to abandon it if it's a coastal community or whatever. We cannot build our way out of this. We can't adapt.
I think it's about that process of working out both what are the cost-effective, low-hanging fruit interventions that can be done right now that will make a difference today and in the next years, and then also investing into that sort of thinking around, well, what could we do in the future if we saw this change? What would be our response? And designing the things we do on the ground now in a way that's cognizant of that, so we're not like locking in or locking out the ability to do the things we might think could be necessary under some of the futures.
Right, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Douglas, I think you've got some questions.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I was just going to ask, first of all, Richard, so does the amount that we will need to spend on adaptation, will that change significantly if Scotland reached net zero sooner than 2045? You know, if it reached net zero tomorrow, would the amount we have to spend on adaptation change significantly, or is that pegged on global emissions?
It's ultimately pegged on global emissions. So, yeah, the climate and the weather we see in Scotland is controlled by the future of global emissions. So the contributions that we make in the UK in terms of reducing emissions and in Scotland is about how it affects the global pathways and how fast the world ultimately starts to reduce emissions and eventually get to net zero will be what sets the ultimate level of climate change that we have to ultimately deal with here in this country.
Okay, and something you mentioned near the start, which I've never actually heard before, you mentioned risks and opportunities on climate change. What would be I've never heard opportunities mentioned before. What would that opportunities be?
So I guess so changing weather conditions will in many ways drive risks, and that's certainly the strongest message that comes through from the risk assessments that have happened in the past, and the one we're currently working on at the moment is that most of this is about risk. There are areas where there are potential opportunities when thinking about the changing climate conditions can make certain higher value agricultural products more viable than they might have been. The classic example that's used in this is, say, sparkling wine in the south of England. It's an example that those climate conditions are now similar to the Champagne region a few decades ago. And so as a sort of high-value product, there is increasing potential of that. But particularly when we think about the nature side of it, because the nature we have is the stuff that has been dealt with the previous climate, that actually the transition and the changes that are happening so fast for nature means that actually the opportunities on the natural side are often very limited, if not none in many cases.
Okay, thank you. And Richard, beyond Scotland, how might impacts on climate change globally affect life in Scotland? I'm thinking here on supply chains, food security, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so climate change is clearly happening globally. We've obviously talked a lot about the changes happening here, but they're happening all over the world, and our economies are fundamentally interconnected with other parts of the world. You know, the UK as a whole, I think, imports about roughly half of the food that we consume comes from overseas. And so, therefore, what's happening in terms of climate change in some of those key producer regions that we import food from, some of the weather extremes happening there can be as important to the prices, the availability of food, certainly for some kinds of food that people see on their shelves in their local shop, their local supermarket, than what's happening here at home on domestic agriculture, as important as that piece is as well. And we've seen examples of, extreme weather in parts of Spain where we get a lot of our, say, fresh fruit from, for instance, that have meant there's been temporary lack of certain kinds of products on the shelves there. So that's one example, is the food system. Other examples are things like finance. Finance is inherently a global system with connections between the big centres, Edinburgh being the second biggest centre in the country, for instance, on finance. And we are exposed to some level to impacts on other financial centres. So, things like if a big hurricane hits Miami and how that affects US markets, some of that will be come to us through the interconnection of the global finance system. So ultimately, Scotland and the UK need to do the bits we can and where we have the levers to help improve our domestic resilience. But without increasing resilience globally, we cannot be fully adapted really ever to a changing climate.
So in Scotland, should we be looking to produce more of our own food? I'm not talking about sparkling wine at this point, but as you mentioned earlier, but should we look trying to produce much more of what we need locally as opposed to having to import that in?
So I think what we do on food is a good example of where businesses are the ones who are going to be best placed to really work out what to do in their supply chains. They know their supply chains better than others. Diverse supply chains are generally considered a part of resilience. So any one concentration from one region, you put all your eggs in one basket, as it were. And we know we've seen big agricultural impacts at home from climate impacts too. So I think looking at the range of options that businesses have for their supply chain resilience is the right one, and I think actually government's role is often making sure that kind of as pragmatic, good information as possible for businesses to be able to make the right decisions that they think is needed along their supply chains for this. Yeah, as opposed to sort of, you know, and necessarily thinking that more domestic production is increased resilience. We've also known that some of these food supply chains have been through quite a stress test recently with the pandemic, say, and how they responded. And obviously we've seen some shortages in that, but overall a system perform relatively well to quite a different kind of shock than climate change would be. But there are definitely learnings on what worked and what didn't in terms of food system resilience from that for climate resilience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, just seeing if there's any more questions. I've got the, again, an easy one at the end. Scotland's kept its ambition for net zero for 2045, but it's lowered its interim emission reductions. You're happy with that? And are we doing enough?
I think so we gave our advice at the start of this year on the decarbonisation trajectory for targets and the new carbon budgets for Scotland, and I think we think that the targets that we've set out are proportionate and can be achieved, and can be done in a way that's sort of beneficial to the people of Scotland and the climate outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. So a trajectory that goes as fast as credibly possible in a way that's pragmatic, cognizant of the technologies and the choices that are needed to achieve it is what has underpinned our advice on that.
It's kind of a politician's answer. The carbon budgets that we got given as a parliament, are they going to achieve, are they making the 2045 target achievable, or are they skating on thin ice? I
think they are. They can make it achievable in the sort of steps down from where we are today on a trajectory that goes on the path to 2045. So all our advice is given on the path of what we think is the right way based on the costs and the technologies to achieve that 2045 target ultimately at the end point.
Of course, the danger always of saying that you've got the last question is a committee member then asked to come in. Mark, and I'll give way to you as long as it's a brief one.
You inspired me, Convener, as ever. Given what you've said, though, about 3 degrees and 4 degrees, I mean, the CCC puts forward different pathways. You've got a balanced pathway. You've also got a high ambition pathway. Should we not be going for the high ambition pathway, given the threats that you've outlined today, the tipping points, the catastrophic impacts of potentially going above 2 degrees? Should you not be on a bit more high ambition rather than balancing things out a bit?
So I think if the trajectory that Scotland has set on the decarbonisation side is delivered, I think that is going to make a difference for the ambition that the world is doing by countries like Scotland and the wider UK delivering their decarbonisation targets, to actually show that sustaining these reductions and continuing to be able to deliver them, setting targets that are pragmatic, ambitious but credible, I think is the thing that resonates internationally. So I think a trajectory that would deliver on what we have, what has been set out, is showing that it can be done at a time when some of the parts of the world are thinking, do we keep to our commitments that are not as ambitious as already as what we're really setting in Scotland or the UK. So making sure that what we set is credible, is delivered, I think is the greatest contribution to nudging the global emissions towards that increase in ambition that might keep the world more aligned to the well below 2 degrees goal, which is the thing that will ultimately bring benefits back in terms of the lower levels of climate change that we ultimately have to prepare for and be resilient to at home.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So Mark did get the last question. There's no further questions, Richard. Thank you very much for coming this morning and indeed offering to come this morning to answer questions as we build up to our scrutiny of the climate change plan, or draft climate change plan that's been laid. So I'm now going to suspend the meeting till 10:45, and I'd like committee members Sorry, I'm going to suspend it till 10:50. If I could ask committee members to be back here at 10:45, because there's a matter I'd like to address before we go into public session. Thank you. So I now suspend the meeting. Okay, and welcome back to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee meeting. We're slightly starting later again, slightly later than I anticipated, so I apologise for anyone who's been kept waiting. Our third item of business this morning is a consideration of two instruments, both being laid under the negative procedure, so will come into force unless the Parliament agrees a motion to annul them, and no motions to annul have been lodged. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have made no comment on either instrument, so I'll seek any views on each of them in turn. The first one is the Vehicle Emission Trading Scheme Amendment number 2, Order 2025. Does anyone have any comments on this? I have a general comment that whilst I have no problem with it, it would be helpful to know the government's position on this and whether by extending the trading scheme for a further period, which allows motor manufacturers to use the future emission standards to trade against the current targets to allow them to achieve their targets, whether that will affect EV vehicles. But in general principle, I agree with it. So I was just going to propose, unless the committee had reason to do otherwise, just write to the government on that basis and ask them to explain that, but make no other comment. Are we happy to do that? Okay. So the second instrument is the Motor Vehicles Competition Trials Scotland Amendment Regulation 2025. Do members have any comments on this instrument? No one has any comments. So can I invite the committee to agree it doesn't wish to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument? Okay. We agreed. The fourth item is consideration of two consent notifications relating to proposed UK statutory instruments. The first is the GB Biocidal Products Amendment Regulations 2025. For some context, under the GB Biocidal Product Regulations, companies must obtain authorisation from the Health and Safety Executive to market biocidal products. Biocidal products are substances or mixtures designed to control harmful organisms like bacteria, virus, fungi, insects or rodents. This proposed amendment relates to the substance of these regulations, this amendment relates not to the substance of these regulations, but to a data protection aspect within them, as outlined in the relevant paper. The committee's role is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government about the proposed change. We can express a view on both, whether we agree in principle to the UK Government legislating in this area and whether we agree with the specific manner which it proposes to do so. If we are content for consent to be given, I will write to the Scottish Government accordingly. In writing to the Scottish Government, we of course have the option to draw matters to the Government's attention, pose questions or to be kept updated on particular matters. If the committee is not content with the proposal, however, it may make one or several recommendations which are outlined in the clerk's note. Does any member have any views on this? I don't see anyone with any moves, so I now move to the substantive question for this item. Is the committee content that the provision set out in the notification should be made in the proposed UK statutory instrument? We are agreed. Thank you. And we'll write to the Scottish Government to that effect. The second instrument relates to a proposed UK statutory instrument is the Control of Mercury Amendment Regulations 2025. The UK SI would add a number of mercury added products, so-called MAPs, to an effectively banned list. The UK and Scottish Government consider that doing this fulfils our international obligations on mercury. As before, the committee's role is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government about this. We can express a view both on whether we agree in principle to the UK Government legislating this area and whether we agree to the specific manner in which it proposes to do so. If we're content for consent to be given, I will write accordingly to the Scottish Government. We have options to draw matters to the attention to the Scottish Government if we want to, and if the committee is not content, we can make one of the recommendations outlined in the clerk's note. Does any member have a view on this? I'm just looking around the room. Are you happy, Mark?
Yeah, thanks, convener. I'm content that this instrument would align ourselves with some of the international conventions on mercury, which are about protecting human health and the environment. I would like to see the UK government go further and actually align with the European Union, particularly on areas like use of mercury, you know, amalgam in dentistry and you know, sodium lights and a range of other areas as well. So it'd be useful to get the Scottish Government's view on whether it considers alignment with the EU on these matters in relation to mercury added products as being something that it wants to work towards, and how it's working on a four-nation basis with other ministers across the UK to achieve that, and by when.
Does anyone else have any comments? It would appear to me that the simple answer then in this question, is that we write, well, I'm going to ask a question, I guess, to be totally correct. Is the committee content with the provision set out in the notification should be made to the proposed UK statutory instrument? I think by the conversations and the look around the room we are, but I think it would be helpful to write to the government to find out where they are in relation to the issues that Mark's raised this morning, and we can do that in a letter, which I guess should technically seek the committee's permission to sign off on their behalf as a result of today. So if you're happy, I'll sign that off. Good, thank you. And we'll write to the government on the effect of the instruments. And we're now going to move into a private session. Thank you.